What? Oh, I want to welcome all my fellow Bible students back to our regularly scheduled weekly Bible study here at St. Matthew Church in Orange, California. And I missed you this past summer, so it's great that we can come together and study the text of Scripture. Last year we did a series on 1st and 2nd Kings in the Old Testament, or what is called the Hebrew Scriptures. This year it was suggested to me that we would do one of the Gospels, and we are doing the Gospel according to St. Mark this year. Now, this is an in-depth study. It will go for many weeks, and those of you who are in the St. Cyprian School of Theology's Diaconate Formation Program, you can get credit for taking this Bible study course. So if you're able to stay with it, that will be of value to you. And I'm thinking that would include Adelia and Tony and Mike. So I have taught on many occasions in the past the Gospel according to St. John, perhaps because there's something about the Gospel of according to St. John that I find to be very attractive, and so I've led many studies of that particular Gospel. I also did a study of the Gospel according to St. Luke here at St. Matthew's, but that's been about at least 10 years ago. And I have done a study of the Gospel according to Matthew. But in all of my professional life in ministry, I have never done a Bible study on the Gospel according to St. Mark. So this is really a great pleasure for me to share this with you and to explore and to examine the Gospel according to St. Mark. I think that a couple of things need to be said in preparation for us getting into the text itself of this Gospel. Mark has probably been historically one of the most neglected Gospels. And the reason why is that most of the material, like more than 90% of what is found in the Gospel of Mark, can also be found in Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel. For many centuries, because of the order of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew was regarded as being the earliest Gospel merely because it shows up on the front of the list. But in more recent centuries, that is the 19th and 20th centuries, biblical scholarship have led the vast majority of biblical scholars to believe that actually the Gospel according to St. Mark is the earliest Gospel. I've read some minority point of views, but I didn't find them persuasive, although they raise some interesting questions. So I tend to go with the majority point of view on this, that Mark's is the earliest Gospel. And that, in fact, Mark's Gospel becomes the source of much of the material that is found in Matthew and Luke's Gospels. In modern times, we would say it looks like Matthew and Luke, or the writers of those two Gospels, were plagiarizing Mark's Gospel. But they didn't think that way in ancient time. And because the narrative in Mark was not something he created, but actually was the common story that was common to the entire early church. In fact, Mark's Gospel is really in written form the traditions that were being shared among the first generation of the church, and in fact, in the early 2nd century, there is a church father by the name of Papias. And I have a Papias, P-A-P-I-A-S. He was a bishop of a very small church in a small town not far from Colossae. You've heard of Colossae. Well, Colossae is also neighbors to 2 other small towns in the interior of Asia, or what was the Roman province of Asia, so probably about 75 miles inland from the Aegean Sea into the Turkish, what is now the Turkish mainland. The river Meander has a tributary which is further inland, and that along where those rivers come together, you find these 3 cities: Laodicea, Colossae, and Hierapolis. And Hierapolis is where Papias was the bishop. I mention him because Papias goes back very early, and it's said that he knew the Apostle John. And so he leaves an interesting record when he is talking about the gospel that we're going to be about to study, where it comes from. And I have the quote on there. You want to get this handout? Who is John Mark? In fact, I have handouts for those of you who've come. And I was wondering if you... But I put a note on the bottom of the page. Who is John Mark? And here is the quote from Bishop Papias, who lived probably in the first, or was bishop in the first decade of the, first or second decade of the 2nd century. Bishop Papias of Hierapolis, early 2nd century, says this: Mark, being the interpreter of Peter, whatsoever he remembered, he wrote accurately. So what it seems to be, what is being said here by Papias, is that Mark, who was a younger contemporary of the Apostle Peter, was with Peter and was taking notes and was writing down the remembrances of the Apostle Peter, probably from his preaching. So we're getting very close to a major apostle, perhaps the one who's best known followers of Jesus himself, an eyewitness. And so in many ways, the Gospel of Mark, according to this tradition, really is the material that you would have heard from the great apostle Peter himself. And that's the testimony of Papias. Papias himself never met either Mark or Peter, and so this is what he heard, and he wrote down very earlier. So very early. So that's the earliest reference we have to the author of the gospel that bears the name Mark. The Gospel of Mark, like the other 3 gospels, are anonymous. No one is telling you who the writer is. But these names have been associated with these 4 gospels early on. And so this is really the result of the tradition of the church. So by the time we get to the dawn of the 2nd century, it's well established that these 4 gospels are associated with these 4 writers that we call evangelists. The word for gospel in the Greek language is euangelion. And euangelion is where we get the word evangel or evangelical or evangelist. And the word gospel itself is actually an Old English word used to translate that Greek word. And many times it's translated as good news. So gospel means good news, or it's translated as a more archaic expression, glad tidings. That seems rather vague to us. But how it was used in the ancient world would be when an announcement of something of tremendous benefit and good to the community was being proclaimed. So think of like a village crier coming into the town. They didn't have newspapers or radio, and so news would travel, or official news someone would come in and tell I don't know who the town crier would be, probably the one with the biggest mouth, was paid to go through the streets and spread the news and make this proclamation. And usually it would be announcing the birth of the firstborn child of a king, or the proclamation of a new emperor coming to rule, these kinds of things. And so that would be called the gospel, or the good news, or the glad tidings. News that are important to you and you ought to have interest in. So that is where the word comes from. So we refer to the 4 gospel writers as evangelists. They are like town criers proclaiming the good news. And of course, Mark is the first one to put this into writing. And by putting it into writing, this oral tradition that was being proclaimed throughout the first century, when it was put into writing, Mark actually, not that he intended to do so, but creates a new genre of literature called a gospel. Sometimes people look to the Gospels that we have thinking they're going to find a biography. And the Gospels as a literary work are not biographies certainly not in the modern sense, nor in the ancient sense of that word. It doesn't give us an account of the life of Jesus as we would expect in most biographies. I mean, there's a lot of things missing that you would expect to find. We know nothing of the childhood of Jesus. We get one glimpse in Luke's gospel. We do have some nativity stories, and we have a nativity story in Matthew's gospel and in Luke's gospel. But in Mark's gospel, there's no mention whatsoever of the birth or the childhood or the family of Jesus. Very little information is given. Nothing. We're told nothing of what school he went to, if he went to any school. We know very little about his life. So as we get into the text of Mark's gospel, we're going to be encountering various narratives that are snapshots from the ministry of Jesus. A period that, if you took Mark's gospel literally, only seems to go for about 1 year. But most New Testament scholars believe, based upon John's testimony, that Jesus' public ministry lasted at least 3 years. And you've heard that before, that he had a 3-year ministry. How did we arrive at that? Well, because there are, John's gospel always notes what the feast day is where Jesus is doing something. And if you follow the narrative from John's gospel, there are 3 mentions of 3 different Passovers that Jesus was celebrating in the course of his ministry. And that's where they get the 3 years. Certainly it wasn't much longer than that, and it's doubtful it would be much shorter, because how could Jesus have the impact that he had in such a short time as a year? Mark's gospel is not giving us necessarily a chronological order of the story. This is what has been told to us also by Papias. So it is a collection of stories that are arranged in such a way. You might get some chronology there, and some of it is implied. For example, when you get into the story of the Passion, which takes up more than a third of the Gospel of Mark, then you're following a narrative that is very sequential, and there's a chronology there. But before we get to the Passion story of Jesus in Mark's gospel, you just have a collection of sayings that Jesus gave, and mostly little stories that illustrate the kind of person Jesus was and what he had come to do. So there are a lot of miracle stories that are to be found in the Gospel according to St. Mark. Now, who was John Mark? And I got a handout here for you that has a lot of this in text. John Mark is a very minor character in the early church as far as anything said about him. He is referred to or mentioned in the New Testament. And I've listed for you there the New Testament references to this person, John Mark. Now, what we do know, based upon these references in the New Testament, and a little bit about what tradition tells us, is that his name was John Mark. Mark was another name that he had, but he also had the typical Jewish name Jonah, which we translate John. And it's not like Mark was a last name. He was John, known as Mark, kind of like Simon, who was also known as Peter, or Thomas, who was also known as Didymus. So it might have been a nickname or a family name given to him. But what is most interesting to me is that the name Mark is a Roman name. This would suggest that in all probability, Mark comes from a family that was well-to-do and recognized by the Romans, and there might have been some sort of relationship with Rome, and he might have been, like the Apostle Paul, a Roman citizen. He comes from a very prominent Jewish family in Jerusalem. And in fact, it is believed, according to tradition, that the upper room where Jesus gathered with his disciples to celebrate the Passover, which becomes his Last Supper, and on the day of Pentecost, when they're in the upper room, they believe was in the same place, was probably in the house of the family of John Mark. It became a gathering place for the early church in Jerusalem. That's where they met. There was a lot of space there. Well, if we rely on the account given to us in the Acts of the Apostles, the upper room could seat 120 people. So it's a good-sized room. And so this was a well-to-do family. Another thing we learn in the Acts of the Apostles is that Mark, John Mark, was the nephew of Barnabas. Barnabas was not one of the 12, but he is a prominent leader in the early church. And Barnabas is first mentioned to us in the Acts of the Apostles as being someone who sold quite a bit of land and took the money and financed the church. So Barnabas himself was a wealthy man, and that would suggest that the social status of John Mark and that family was this was a well-to-do Jerusalem family that was Jewish and at the same time had connections with Rome, Roman connections. Mark was probably a child when Jesus was doing his public ministry. And he goes with his uncle Barnabas later, after the church has already been born and it's been in existence for a few years, and he goes to Antioch in Syria. And there, Barnabas becomes a missionary companion of Saul of Tarsus, or St. Paul the Apostle. When St. Paul had his dramatic conversion, and you're all familiar with his dramatic conversion, remember he persecuted the church, and then after the dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, the church wasn't sure whether they should receive Paul because they regarded him as a dangerous man. Was this some kind of trick? And it was Barnabas who went and fetched Paul from Tarsus and brought him down to the church of Antioch and vouched for him. So it was on the word of Barnabas that Paul was fully received and people began to believe his story of his dramatic conversion and that he really was one of us, so to speak. It was the church in Antioch that decided to send out a team of missionaries headed by Barnabas and Paul, and they took others with them. So do not think of it just two guys on the road. They had a group of people that went on this mission. And you get the feeling that Barnabas was the one who was in charge, and Paul was like his assistant. That would quickly change if you read the narrative in the Acts of the Apostles. And one of the members of their mission team was the nephew of Barnabas, the young man called John Mark, who was a very young adult maybe at this time. Maybe we would say a teenager at this time. We're really not sure how old he was. And he went on the first missionary journey. Antioch is in what we call Syria today. It was considered Syria at that time as well. So they departed from Antioch, and the first place they missionized was an island in the eastern, a large island in the eastern Mediterranean called Cyprus. Anyone been to Cyprus before? You've been to Cyprus, John. Yeah. And the topography of Cyprus, it's a larger island than Catalina, but it's kind of like Catalina, but much larger. Wouldn't you say?
I would say, and the ruins there on the coast, can't recall the name of the city now, but the roads were Roman built.
The roads in Cyprus are, which are still used to this day. Were built by the Romans.
But that island has a distinct record of being invaded by anybody in the Mediterranean that ever owned a boat.
Yeah, they were always being invaded. Kind of like Sicily in the west and Cyprus in the east. And even now the island is divided in half between two warring factions. So they go to Cyprus first to missionize Cyprus. And the question is, why did they go there? Why didn't they take a different route and go somewhere else? Well, the Acts of the Apostles gives us a little bit of insight, because Barnabas himself, even though he's Jewish and he belongs to this prominent Jewish family that had a large home in Jerusalem, Barnabas himself was a native of Cyprus. So it makes perfect sense that when they left Antioch, because of the proximity, rather than taking an overland route, they went on a boat and went across, and they did their first missionary work together, Paul and Barnabas, along with John Mark, in the island of Cyprus. And you can read an account of that mission. They were very successful in Cyprus, and they depart from Cyprus after spending a time there, and they go directly north to the coastland of the southern coast of what is now Turkey. The Turks weren't there at this time. The Turks were still in Central Asia. So in the ancient world, even though we think of this as the country of Turkey, there was no idea that the Turks even existed at this time. The population of that part of the world was mainly Greek. There were Lydians there, and there were Armenians there. And in the central plateau of Turkey, there was a large population of the Keltoi, or the Gauls, and they were called Galatians. And that is when Paul and Barnabas continue their first missionary journey, and they go up to this area in central, what is now Turkey. I can't remember the name of the peninsula that's called. There's another more ancient name. And I keep thinking Iberian Peninsula, but that's Spain and Portugal. I can't remember it. I'll have to get back to you about that. Anyone remember? Okay. I know what's happening now is that Mike Mitchell is looking this up. We'll find it eventually. So when they arrive there, and we're not told this directly why this happened, but John Mark doesn't want to continue on. And so he decides to return back to Antioch. So he leaves. So he's no longer a part of the missionary team And Barnabas and Paul continue their missionary activity and work. Now, why is this important? Well, our first glimpse of Mark is that he's a young man. He's going with his uncle and this feisty new convert, Paul, and they're doing a missionary journey. They're having a great deal of success, and then he abruptly leaves and returns home. Later on in the narrative, Barnabas and Paul, they had such success with their first missionary journey in which they founded all kinds of churches throughout Galatia and on the island of Cyprus, that they decide to go on a second missionary journey later. And as they're getting ready, putting the mission together, getting the manpower and supplies and whatever they needed to depart on the second missionary journey, their intention was they were going to visit the churches in Cyprus that they had founded earlier at the first missionary journey, strengthen and encourage them, and then go back to the churches in Galatia and do the same. And then God knows where they were going to be led to continue on to new territory to proclaim the gospel. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with them on the team. And Paul was adamant, no way. So now even though there was no commentary why John Mark left the missionary team, we now know that Paul harbors hard feelings. In other words, he felt that John Mark abandoned them and left because for whatever reason. But that did not please Paul. Barnabas insisted that John Mark go with them, and Paul disagreed. In fact, this disagreement was so severe that Barnabas, who did so much for Paul, and Paul, who did so much with Barnabas in the first missionary journey, they part ways. And as far as we know, they never reconciled. And they parted ways over the issue of bringing John Mark along on this missionary journey. So what happens is that Barnabas takes John Mark and his team, and they go back to Cyprus. Paul takes along a new companion by the name of Silas. You heard of Paul and Silas. And they depart and go back to Galatia. So the second missionary journey of Paul begins with the departure of Barnabas and John Mark. And then Barnabas disappears altogether from the narrative. He never comes back. And as far as we can tell, John Mark in the Acts of the Apostles never comes back. He's never mentioned again. So what became of John Mark? Well, here's the curious thing. Years later, when Paul is writing letters to the various churches, he mentions Mark. And he mentions Mark. Okay. He mentions Mark in very glowing terms. He expresses great affection for Mark. And so this would suggest to us that eventually Paul at least reconciled with John Mark. And in fact, John Mark is there in the city of Rome when Paul is imprisoned in the last years of Paul's missionary career, when he was in Rome before Paul was put to death. So Mark was there. We also have a strong tradition that Peter also was in Rome about the same time. This would have been, Jesus would have been crucified in the year 30. And Paul and Peter were in Rome in the 60s. So about 35 years after Jesus, Paul and Peter are both in Rome. They both have been imprisoned, and they're both writing letters. The letter that was written by Peter is called 1 Peter. And in 1 Peter, he makes reference to Mark was with him. So we know he was a companion. This gives credence to the claim of Papias, or the remembrance of Papias, that Mark was a missionary companion of Peter in Rome at the time of the first great persecution of Christianity by the Roman state under Caesar Nero. We know from tradition that both Peter and Paul during that persecution lost their lives. However, Mark somehow ends up, according to tradition, in Alexandria, Egypt. And he is considered the founding apostle of the church that is in Alexandria, Egypt. And he is considered the first bishop of the church in Alexandria, and the Egyptian Coptic church, which has existed from the first century, is in fact a church that claims that their apostolic succession goes all the way back to St. Mark, and that St. Mark was the founder of their church. It is in Alexandria, Egypt, according to the tradition of the church, that Mark himself is martyred for the faith. So that gives you a little bit of the history of who this person was. He was a rather minor character, but he is there present with the apostles. And so it's interesting that the gospel that was written by him, or the earliest gospel that's attributed to him, becomes associated with him, even though in the gospel it never identifies who the author is. But the early church is convinced it was. And it is believed by most scholars that the gospel according to St. Mark was written and distributed first in the city of Rome. So Mark probably wrote this down, realizing that the days were numbered for Peter, and we'll get this written down, and this is how we come up with the Gospel of Mark as, yes, Polly.
So Mark is not recognized as the author of this Gospel. He's thought to be, but he's not definitely recognized as.
Well, first of all, the Gospel is anonymous. The writer doesn't say, this is coming from me, written by John Mark. But the earliest testimony of the church, and it's quite early, it would have been within the lifetime of people who would have known those people, say that it was Mark. So I wouldn't say that we don't know who wrote the gospel, but the gospel itself doesn't identify who the author is, but the overwhelming testimony of the early church, which we call tradition, says that Mark is the man. And it's interesting because they could have picked anybody. Why this minor character? So that almost leads credence to the testimony. Why would this minor character be attributed with having written this gospel? So that has an air of truth. Because they could have said, Peter wrote this gospel. They could have attributed it to anybody, but they didn't.
What about the other gospels? Were they signed?
They're all four are anonymous. But we have the early testimony of the church, which we call tradition, that says these gospels were written by so-and-so. Now, a couple of things that I think is important to... I think I neglected to mention this. The relics of Mark, you know what relics are? His skeleton, his bones, what's left of him, was in Alexandria, Egypt for a long time until the Islamic expansion. And when the Muslims were spreading Islam across part of the Middle East, the Egyptians, Christians, of course, became concerned of what will happen to his relics. And they eventually were taken out of Alexandria, and ultimately they ended up in Venice. And the Cathedral of St. Mark, which is in Venice, which is a historic building, there contained within that cathedral are what is reputably the actual bones or the relics of the evangelist Mark.
They were supposed to give them back, they just said, nah.
Yeah, because relics were very highly valuable. It was like, yeah, too bad.
Well, Venice became like the superpower
Yeah, it was.
of its age, and they just said, no, we're not giving them
Yeah,
Take them if you want them, but good luck.
yeah.
Have
So,
all the warships and all the trade routes and control of the whole region. That's all I guess, like 1,400 or so.
yeah,
They said, no, we're not giving them back. They're ours. Do that, so sad.
yeah. They're not going to let go of them. So that's just a little footnote on the history. Now, there are a couple of things that I think are very curious about the Gospel according to St. Mark, and I want to mention this to you. This came out when we were studying the Gospel of John a couple of years ago, and that is when you are reading through the Gospel according to St. Mark, you find something that, to me, becomes very important. You find what are called irrelevant, what is it called? Irrelevant
details.
Irrelevant details. An irrelevant detail is when the writer's telling the story and then he throws in a detail that has nothing to do with moving the narrative forward. It doesn't affect the story at all. So why, and it has no relevance, and yet it's mentioned. Why is that? Well, one of the things that Martha told me, because she works for the courts as a forensic psychologist, is that when they're listening to testimony from people who are in court giving testimony, they are paying attention to when there are irrelevant details mentioned by the witness. Because irrelevant details suggest that the testimony being given is credible. If you're making up a story, you're making sure everything fits into and is moving the narrative forward. You're not going to throw in irrelevant details. Well, you find this a lot in John's Gospel, and you find it in Mark's Gospel. I'll give you an example. In the story of the crucifixion, Jesus carries his cross, right? And then he's no longer able to carry it. What happens?
They pull somebody out of the crowd.
They pull someone out of the crowd. And in Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, as well as in Mark's Gospel, they even tell you the name of the person. What's the name of the person? Simon. That's right, Simon of Cyrene. They didn't have to mention Simon of Cyrene. Why would they mention his name? He's such a minor character. They could have said the Romans pulled someone out of the crowd and had him carry the cross for Jesus. Why is his name mentioned? Well, it's mentioned because probably people knew, who were reading the gospel or hearing it told, knew Simon of Cyrene. It had relevance in that particular time and place, even though it's really irrelevant to us. I mean, I like it that he has a name, but it is an irrelevant detail. But in Mark's Gospel, unlike Matthew and Luke's Gospel, he adds something else. Simon of Cyrene, the father of Rufus and Alexander. Well, if you're reading this, who is Rufus and Alexander? But the community to which this written gospel was given, they knew who Rufus and Alexander was. That's why it's mentioned. It was relevant to them. It's no longer relevant to us. But this adds to the credibility of the account because Mark is full of what we would call irrelevant details. It doesn't move the story forward at all. Who cares who the sons of Cyrene, Simon of Cyrene were? It's irrelevant to us. It doesn't say anything about the story other than we know a few names of some of the people. Other than that, we can't match the names to anything. So this is really interesting. Well, in the Gospel of Mark, we find two passages in which we have something that seems irrelevant. In particular is the passage found in Mark chapter 14. I have it here listed for you on the note. It's in the Garden of Gethsemane. You know this agony in the garden story. Jesus himself is arrested, and the rest of the disciples flee. This account of the agony in the garden, and the arrest of Jesus, which begins his passion story, is found in all four Gospels. But it's only in the Gospel of Mark that we find a particular irrelevant detail. And I want to draw your attention to it. Here's what it says in chapter 14, verses 51 and 52. At the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, now a young man followed him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth about his body. They, that is the guards, seized him, but he left the cloth behind and ran off naked. Jesus is being arrested. The apostles are fleeing. And then you have this little story. We don't. There's a young youth who is there following from behind. He's unnamed. He's wearing a linen cloth, and that tells us something about his identity. And then he is. They try to seize him and grab him as well, but he slips out of their hands, and they're holding his linen cloth that he had wrapped around him. A linen cloth would be something that would be worn by someone who was wealthy. Otherwise, it would have just been something made out of wool or cotton or something like that. So this youth comes from a wealthy family in Jerusalem. And it has nothing to do with the story. It's an irrelevant detail. Why is it in Mark's gospel? And it's so irrelevant that when Matthew and Luke copy this story, they drop that piece out of the narrative because it had no relevance to their the story they were telling, and so they just dropped this reference. And yet it's in the gospel here. Could it be that Mark, who was in Jerusalem at the time of the death of Jesus, was inserting himself in the story? Was this a self-reference? I was there, and I was that youth, which would have been like, 10 or 12 years of age. He was there. And if the Passover or the Last Supper was celebrated in the upper room in his family's house, could he have been there in Gethsemane when the arrest took place of Jesus? So is Mark inserting himself into the narrative here? Yes?
Why would the kids show up wearing only a linen cloth? For what reason?
What was the question?
Why would a young kid show up in the Garden of Gethsemane wearing only a linen cloth? What's that?
The weather's hot.
Yeah, it could have been it was in the spring. Could have been his night clothing. I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know why. It's a very peculiar passage to find in this. So yes.
Could it be foreshadowing the men dressed in white in the tomb?
Yes, and I have that here. That's really good.
Foreshadowing the young man in the tomb.
So,
Oh, yeah.
so I always thought this was an interesting passage, but then at the end of Mark's gospel, it's about the announcement of the resurrection. And the young man in the garden tomb only shows up in Mark's gospel. He's a young man in a tomb, the same word, a youth. Is that youth in the tomb Mark himself? It doesn't say he was an angel. In Mark's gospel, it was a youth dressed in a white robe. He's in the tomb. So let's read that passage from Mark chapter 16. You should have the handout. So who was John Mark? When the Sabbath was over, this is very familiar to you, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. So this is early before sunrise on Sunday morning. Very early when the sun had risen, on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll back the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a white robe, and they were utterly amazed. Now, it wasn't that they were utterly amazed at seeing a young man. They were utterly amazed to see that the tomb was empty of the body of Jesus. The stone rolled back, and all there is this little kid there in a white robe sitting where Jesus' body was laid, and they're amazed. And then the youth says to them, he said to them, do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him as he told you. Then they went out and fled from the tomb, seized with trembling and bewilderment. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's the end of the gospel. In Mark's gospel, there is no resurrection appearance of Jesus. It's just an empty tomb with a youth, a young boy, saying, he's raised from the dead. Is that John Mark? And if it is, it would explain why he abruptly ends the gospel. It ends with him saying, he's raised from the dead. That's all you needed to know. And that ends his gospel. There is a later ending that other authors who were frustrated that there wasn't more said would add a longer ending to Mark's gospel, but it's not the same as the writer or the evangelist himself. But it would seem like a logical place in the mind of the writer where to end it. So Mark is inserting himself in the story, first as the young boy at Gethsemane at the arrest of Jesus. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense why that story is there. And the same language is used to describe that one who is sitting inside the tomb when Mary Magdalene arrives with the other, Mary and Salome. What do you think? Interesting. Yeah, just a possibility. That's
So
right.
He's kind of claiming secret knowledge also, that he knew what Jesus was up. He said I'll talk to Jesus, or he talked to angels, or he talked to somebody that gave him a heads up. So
Yeah.
he could make the proclamation.
Yeah. So in a way, what Mark is saying, if this indeed are self-references, I'm an eyewitness. I was there. I saw the empty tomb.
Wouldn't you say that even more plainly if he was?
He could have.
What was that?
He could have.
Oh, I said, wouldn't he have made it a lot more plain if he actually was a witness? Would he not have said to the apostles, I saw him that, or, you know.
Yeah. The gospel's written in the third person. He doesn't write it in the first person. And yeah, he could have said it very directly, but maybe he was using a literary device, a way of inserting himself into the story. Why he wouldn't say more? Anyone have any ideas about this?
Maybe
By
he was
this time-
looking, he
Sorry.
might have nothing to know where he was.
One of the doors walking around with some piece of linen.
By this time, the church is under persecution.
Yes.
So to say if he maintained any of his prominence, still social or financial prominence, he would put it at risk by identifying.
That's a really good explanation.
What was the point?
I want to repeat what Bill said for the sake of the recording, and that is that Bill is saying, hey, if he was from a prominent family with the connections that we described earlier, and this was written in Rome when Christians were being hunted down and persecuted, perhaps there was a reason why he left something more identifying there. Maybe thinking that the readers in Rome who would be reading this would know who it was, what he was referring to. But he doesn't leave any evidence to his identity if the written document falls in the hands of the enemy. So that would explain why the ambiguity in not coming right out and saying who he was. It could be. That sounds plausible to me. Thank you, Bill. I like that very much. It never occurred to me. Bill brings up something really important here. Unlike Matthew and John's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, the community that this first Gospel is being written to is a community that is under duress. Many of the members of the church in Rome were arrested and persecuted, being thrown to the lions and all kinds of other horrible things that were happening to them. And you get a sense of this when you read the Gospel of Mark. One of the things you're going to notice in Mark's Gospel, well, let me put it this way. What was the first miracle Jesus ever performed? The wedding at Cana, turning water into wine. That is according to John. John said his first miracle was at a wedding in Cana of Galilee. What was that miracle? Transforming water into wine at a wedding feast. The whole theme of John's Gospel is a theme of transformation. Being born again, being brought from death to life. It's all about transformation. That is the theme throughout John's Gospel. Mark's Gospel, what is the first miracle that Jesus performs in John's Gospel? And it's not a miracle at a wedding of turning water into wine.
I think if I remember correctly, it's healing the leper or something like that.
Well, that's very close. But there was even a miracle, his very first miracle in John's Gospel.
Casting out demons.
He casts out a demon. Interesting. Because there's this theme throughout Mark's Gospel that Jesus is the one who is conquering the devil, casting out the evil one. That is the first miracle performed there. Anyway, I want you draw your attention to the synoptic problem. Yeah, Mother Diane, you have something you want to say?
Let's go back to Mark 14, 51 through 52 for a second. Wearing nothing but a linen cloth about his body. It doesn't say that this is just a loin cloth. He could have had a whole linen garment wrapped around him.
Yeah.
And I think we should be aware of that because it makes a little bit more sense then. We don't have to worry so much about why was he practically nude in the middle of the night.
Yeah, and they didn't wear underwear like we wear today. So that's why he ran off naked.
There's so many, the white robe, who wears white robes? It's a robe, it's white. There's so much we don't know.
Yeah.
So, is that a clue?
Could be a clue.
So I'm curious about those details.
Yeah.
That's a historical, What do
Yeah.
people wear, How common is a robe? How common is a white robe? Does that say something about this person?
That's a good question.
Just
I wonder.
about the number of servants they had.
Yeah.
It
The number of
doesn't say it's
servants they
white.
had.
What's that?
It does not say that it was white
It does in the resurrection appearance.
in the resurrection appearance.
Yeah, story, but not in the garden. It just says it's linen. Yeah. Okay. What? No. What?
We're talking about two different things. I'm talking.
You're talking about the
entrance,
in the tomb?
the tomb,
in the tomb. Yeah.
and it is a white robe.
Yeah. He's
Cloaked
wearing a
in
white robe. Yeah. Now, some people presumed that was an angel. Haven't you thought that young man was an angel? Well, that's only Mark doesn't tell you that. And we don't know how many people were visiting and entering that tomb and looking around, and they saw different things. In Matthew's gospel, or let's say, or Luke's gospel, a group of women go into the tomb and they see two men who were angels that were wearing outfits that were dazzling as light. And it says two angels.
Whose account was that?
That's Luke's account.
Comes up with it.
So people presume because Luke said there was these two angels, then Mark's account is, well, that must be one of the angels. But Mark doesn't say that. He says a boy in a white robe. So we have to listen to what Mark is telling us, and Mark's not telling us about any angels at the tomb. Doesn't mean there weren't angels at the tomb. It just means in his particular account, it's a boy. And so for us to then say that it was an angel, that's not in the text, is it? Not what Mark's telling us. Mark's telling us it was a boy. It was telling these women that Jesus was raised from the dead, and he says, go back to Galilee. He's going to meet you there. Yes?
Nobody seems to be concerned about how those rocks seem to, or that big rock seemed to be moved.
Well, they were worried about who was going to do it, but then when they got there, yeah.
Well, you wouldn't be any stronger than the women. So who's this, how do we, and was raised, that's the other thing. Is that an inference that he didn't, he wasn't, he was raised?
Yes.
What does that mean? Does that mean that so that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it means that he was raised. In other words, someone else raised him.
Yeah, there's an inference that there's some other being or person or thing that was involved there, and that this youth observed it happen. He was raised.
Yeah.
He's announcing he was raised. Don't he? Okay.
Yeah. Someone raised Jesus from the dead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now,
Very mysterious.
yeah. Now, St. Paul will say it was the Holy Spirit. God the Father. God raised him from the dead. You hear things like that. But Jesus is being, in other words, he's passive. And he's being raised, which would mean it would be someone else who's doing it. Yeah. Wow. Good observation. We're going to have a good time when we finally get to the last chapter of Mark's Gospel. I want to draw your attention to what we call the synoptic problem. 3 of the Gospels in the New Testament are called synoptic Gospels. And this means to with, and this would be to see. So what they mean by synoptics is Gospels is that they need to be seen together because they're very similar. You can almost line up Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you'll see the similarities. They have a certain narrative structure, and they all follow the narrative structure with the same stories and a lot of the same sayings. It's almost like they're redundant. I remember when I was 15 years old, I read straight through the Gospel of Matthew. And then I thought, wow, I read the Gospel of Matthew. Now I'm going to read Mark. And then when I was reading through Mark, I thought, I just read all this. I thought it would be like a completely different account. It was like there were so many things that were exactly the same. And being a 15-year-old, I can't tell the difference between Mark or Matthew. They seem pretty much the same. Well, after a more careful, detailed study, you realize there's all kinds of differences. But basically, they look astonishingly alike. And that is because one or the other is copying each other. Plagiarism, and you find the same problem in Luke's Gospel. Well, I want to remove that. So we have 3 Gospels that are called synoptic Gospels because they're amazingly alike. And so how did they come up with their material? what can account for this, for the similarities, which are striking, between those three Gospels, and how do you account for the subtle differences between the three? And so comes this, that's called the synoptic problem. How do you account for the similarities and differences with these three Gospels? And they have what is called a theory called the four-document hypothesis. And this is how it goes. And you got this sheet here? Got it? Okay. So I'm going to put a box here, and this represents Mark's Gospel. Okay? Next to this is another box, and you can draw a box around your paper there, is a document that we'll call M. We really don't know if it was a document, but it is a source called M. And then we have another one that's called Q. Not the Star Trek character. And then we have another source called L. Got that? Now I want you to write in, you see where it says Matthew here on your paper? Okay, put a box around Matthew. Got that? And then you have Luke. Over here, put a box around that. Now, if we read carefully Matthew, we find that there's a huge amount of material, like 90% of the material that's in Mark ends up in Matthew, a lot of it in the same order, in the same language. Obviously, it seems that one or the other is copying, but let's just say Mark's the earliest one and it existed first, and Matthew, or the people who put Matthew together, took material from Mark. It's found in his Gospel. Got that? Now, we see that Luke has material that is taken from Mark. A vast amount of material. So we can say that Mark's Gospel can be found in Luke's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel. In other words, Matthew and Luke were using Mark. They both had Mark in front of them. Yes?
They have an arrowhead on Matthew and Luke then, right?
Yeah, the arrow goes from Mark down to, how's that?
Yeah.
You like the arrows there? Okay. Now, there is material that is found in Matthew's Gospel and also found in Luke's Gospel. Material that they share, but is not found in Mark. Material that you find in Matthew and Luke looks very similar, but not found in Mark. That means there's some other source. And they call that source Q, from the German word Quell, which means source. So we have Matthew utilizing material from Q. And that same material shows up in Luke's Gospel. And when you read Matthew and Luke, you realize they get so much of their material from two common sources. Mark, we know about, and the other common material that's common to these two is found here in Q. But apparently Luke doesn't know about Matthew, and Matthew does not know about Luke. That seems very apparent. How do I know to say that? Because the nativity stories are totally different. If Luke had Matthew's nativity, why wouldn't he include it? And if Matthew had Luke's nativity story, why wasn't it included? We actually have two different nativity stories. They don't contradict each other. You can see how they complement each other, but they're two different stories. So these two authors were looking at some common sources. One of them could have been Mark. Another would be an unnamed source called Q. However, there is material only found in Matthew's Gospel, and not found in Mark, and not found in Luke. So Matthew has his own little extra source. We call that M. And Luke has material that Matthew doesn't have, nor does Mark. Let me give you an example. Besides the Nativity, there was the birth of John the Baptist. That only shows up in Luke's Gospel. There's the story of Jesus as a 12-year-old youth in the temple in Jerusalem, only in Luke's Gospel. There is also the story of when Jesus returns to Nazareth and he reads the passage from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me," and then he says, "Today this was fulfilled in your hearing," and then the crowd gets angry and they take him to a top of a hill to throw him off to stone him. Remember that story? Only in Luke's Gospel. Or here's one that you know even better. The Good Samaritan. Only found in Luke's Gospel. In fact, the Good Samaritan is so wonderful, you would think that if Mark knew it or Matthew knew it, they would have included that story. Or the story of the prodigal son. These are big stories. Nowhere to be found in Matthew and Mark. Apparently they were not aware of it. But Luke had these stories. And this story material that's unique to Luke comes from another source we're calling L. So, the theory is you have 4 original sources that are used by Matthew and Luke. And they didn't all have the same material in front of them. Yeah, Bill?
So isn't there some, belief that Luke, whoever the writer of Luke was a confidant of Mary, the mother, and that much of his narrative might have been about his association with her? I know that's legendary, but...
Well, I think there's some, when you have the legends, somehow, this is about the thing about tradition, there's some element of truth. There's some memory in the church that has persisted. For example, the very first iconographer wasn't Mark, but you know what an icon is, was, according to tradition, the very first icon was written by Luke. And there's an early tradition that Luke was an artist. He was a physician. He was also an artist. And the tradition is that the very first icon that was ever, I'll say, painted, was done by Luke, and it was of the Virgin Mary and the child Jesus. Now, this is a strong tradition, and if you look at the literary artistry of Luke, it's vastly superior than any of the other New Testament documents. I mean, he writes like an artist would write. He paints vivid pictures for you. His Greek is excellent. Mark's Greek is very rough. It's like someone who, Greek is a second language, and they're writing broken Greek. I'm trying to think, someone I knew, I worked for an Italian family, and my employer English was a second language, he would write notes for me to do things when I worked for him years and years ago, and he wrote like he talked, with the extra vowels, how Italians are, and all this misspelled words and all that. Okay, anyway, to get back to what you were saying, Bill, that there is this interest that Luke has in information that could have only come from Mary. So there's an affinity between Luke's gospel and the gospel according to Luke's gospel and what we know about the Blessed Virgin Mary. And there is a belief that Luke was compiling and collecting information for his gospel when Paul was in prison in Caesarea before he went to Rome. Paul was there for, I think, 18 months under house arrest in Caesarea. Luke was with him part of that time. So Luke would have been in Palestine at the same time the other disciples would have been around, and he was free to come and go, and he might have interviewed the Virgin Mary. I mean, that's speculation, but that becomes a real plausible thing, because there's things Luke writes about that only that could only have been known to Mary. How she held these things in her heart and pondered them. It seems like a very personal statement to say. So he was privy to something with Mary. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Okay. If this is true, then Mark becomes profoundly important to us because he is one of the earliest sources of the narrative that we have in the Gospels. He's one of the earliest sources. In fact, so early that he is used by 2 later Gospel writers. The question is, when was Mark written? Well, I've given you a clue already. Mark's Gospel was probably written during the persecution of Nero. And we know that this occurred in the mid-60s. We think that Peter was martyred in the year 64. So if the testimony of Papias is close or nearly close enough to the truth, that would mean that Mark's Gospel was written no later than 65. I'll put AD or Common Era CE. That makes it pretty early. Okay, is this helpful? Is this useful to you? Yeah, yeah, Meredith.
I have a question. Is there evidence that it was written before the destruction of the temple in the 70s?
It's hard for me to answer that question. The temple was destroyed in 70, so this dates it probably in 65. I am finding most scholars believe it was written before the destruction of the temple.
I just wondered if there was any evidence in the text for that.
Yeah, no, there's nothing in the text that would suggest to us that it was before the destruction of the temple.
Just curious.
No direct, yeah,
There doesn't seem to be any allusion
right,
to the destruction of the temple.
that's right.
So that would kind of confirm that it was.
Kind of the absence of that. Well, I think that all of the documents in the New Testament, most all of them, were written before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And the reason I say that is that none of the New Testament documents ever suggest, it's as if they didn't know the temple was destroyed. To give you an idea of how the absence of any reference to the destruction of the temple in any of the 27 books of the New Testament, it is a startling omission. Why? Because the destruction of the temple in 70 AD in Jerusalem was a world-shaking event. It's like 9/11 to us. It was huge. This was no little shrine that got burnt to the ground. This was a major city in the Mediterranean. The temple in Jerusalem, after Herod the Great finished renovating it, was considered by many to be one of the great wonders of antiquity. It was an amazing thing. It had a lot of symbolism. When the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, it sent shockwaves throughout the whole ancient world. First of all, it was a total disaster for both Jews and Christians, because both Jews and Christians worshipped at the temple in Jerusalem. And it was a holy place for both Christians and Jews, but also for everybody else, because all those other multi-ethnic groups that lived in the Roman Empire, if they ever thought about rebelling against the empire, look what happened to the Jews. Look what happened to their city. Look what happened to their temple. Yeah.
And weren't Jews, didn't they comprise about 10% of the empire at that time?
Yeah, they were pretty, they were easily to identify. They lived everywhere, and they were usually well-to-do because they were very industrious people. And one of the things, the reason why Jews in the ancient world were able to, upward mobility is because most Jewish, I'll have to say men in this case, most Jewish men were literate.
Yeah.
The average person in the ancient world was not literate, but the average Jewish man was. Why? Because he went to synagogue school to learn to read Hebrew so he could be bar mitzvahed. So as a ethnic group, the Jews had a high level of literacy in comparison to, say, Greeks or Scythians or Gauls or Keltoi or Lydians or Armenians or even Romans. Yeah.
And plus, Latin was the language of the commoners in in Rome.
Yeah, Latin was the language of the commoners in Rome. Although the educated classes spoke and read Greek. So Greek became the language of the empire. At this time, Latin was the language of the city of Rome among the population. The Romans adored, and they loved anything that had to do with Greek culture. And they just adopted it over, even their language, at this particular time. Here's one of the things that is evidence that Mark was written in Rome. There are certain words in the Gospel of Mark, and it only shows up in Mark's Gospel, that are Latin-derived words. Do you know the story of when Jesus cast out the man who had had a whole army of demons in him? Remember, what is your name? My name is Legion, because there's many of us in here. Remember that story? The word legion is a Latin word that's used in the Gospel of Mark. It's not using a Greek word. So the suggestion is that these, they call them Latinisms, were found in Mark's Gospel, which would suggest the environment in which it was written. Okay. Well, we've come to the end of our time. This is our introduction, and we're going to get to the text starting next week. Thank you, everybody.